Hello everyone, Dr. Polaris here. On the 19th of July 1843, the Morning Herald newspaper of Sydney, Australia, reported a story concerning the sighting of a mystery animal. Quote, "We are credibly informed that several parties have been unexpectedly alarmed by the sudden appearance in the neighbourhood of Mangrove of a monster, which they designate a Yahoo from the noise he makes, who has come upon persons when encamping at night, and to others in the vicinity of their houses. He is described as being nearly 7 feet in height, with feet apparently like a human, only of enormous size, with his visage turned backwards, and his body covered with apparently a down. He appears to be harmless, never having been known to commit violence, and always utters his uncouth Yahoo. There are parties who persist in stating that he was close to their house in Mangrove. Eyewitnesses whose veracity we have no reason to doubt is fully borne out by their serious and impressive description. About 3 months since, 2 young people, brother and sister, being left at home in Mangrove Creek about midday, hearing a strange noise, and the dogs barking violently, went out and upon looking in the direction of a myrtle scrub opposite, to which their attention was directed to by the dogs, they observed a dark hairy figure, which, from its height above the scrub, they conjectured to be nearly 8 feet. Against the figure the rage of the dogs was directed. Being alarmed, they ran for a neighbour, who, upon arrival, was equally frightened at the strange visage and uncouth sounds of the monster. Shortly after, the dogs made a rush, and the figure went off in an opposite direction. One of the dogs, we should observe, remained away above half an hour, and returned quite exhausted." Unquote. The large ape-like creature described in this account has since become a fixture of Australian cryptozoology, although it now goes under a different name, the Yowie. Generally speaking, this cryptid is described, at least in modern times, as having a very set appearance, being similar to the North American Sasquatch or the Himalayan Yeti, standing between 7 and 12 feet tall, with a pelt of shaggy fur that ranges from black to brown to red. Its arms are said to be greatly elongated and sometimes furnished with sharp claws, while its demeanour does vary greatly depending on the alleged sighting. Sometimes the Yowie is presented as being shy and cryptic, while in other accounts it is said to be highly aggressive. All this is in stark contrast to the bunyip, another famous Australian mystery animal that I've covered in an older video, which is far more hazily defined and can resemble absolutely anything. However, these two beings do have certain similarities. Both have their origins in southeastern Australia, with the first written reports by British colonists first appearing during the early 19th century. Both are also derived, either wholly or in part, from indigenous Aboriginal belief systems, with appropriated versions spreading across the country, far from their original contexts, following the expansion of print media during the second half of the 19th century. Reports of so-called hairy wild men, or Australian apes, date back almost to the arrival of the first British colonists, with the first detailed written accounts emerging during the 1840s in New South Wales. As in the earlier account, these ape men are often referred to not as Yowies, more on that term later, but as Yahoos. In a narrative dating to 1842, recorded in Robert Holden's book Bunyips, Australia's Folklore of Fear, the creatures are described as being a common part of Aboriginal cultures, stating that, quote, "The natives of Australia believe in the Yahoo, this being they describe as resembling a man of nearly the same height, with long white hair hanging down from the head over the features. The arms are extraordinarily long, furnished at the extremities with great talons, and the feet turned backwards, so that, on flying from man, appears as if the being had travelled in the opposite direction. Altogether, they describe it as a hideous monster of an unearthly character and ape-like appearance." Unquote. Appeals to Aboriginal knowledge of indigenous apes were often used to validate the realism of mystery animal sightings. For example, the edition of the Town and Country Journal, dated to the 11th of November 1876, noted that, quote, "Who has not heard, from the earlier settlement of the colony, the blacks speaking of some unearthly animal or inhuman creature, that inhabited some part of the wildest, inaccessible, rugged, and sequestered haunts of rocky mountains and gorges in the colony, namely the Yahoo Devil or the Hairy Man of the Woods, which to this day they stand in fearful awe and terror of, unquote. Modern Yowie enthusiasts also carry on this tradition, providing a whole host of Aboriginal names that all supposedly describe the same flesh and blood Sasquatch-like ape man. These include, but are not limited to, Quinkin, Jugabina, Wawi, Pankalangu, Jimbra, and Changara. However, if you've seen Trade the Explainer's excellent video on the native Bigfoot, you may have already noted a problem with all this. These names derive from different Aboriginal cultures across Australia and almost certainly do not describe the exact same large bipedal hominid. Indeed, as evidenced in the aforementioned 1842 account, the oldest written sources from a European perspective present a being that is clearly supernatural, with its backward feet and ability to confuse those following its tracks. The great talons on the hands also don't sound at all ape-like. Examining some of the proposed alternative Yowie names also reveal entities that clearly sound like spirits rather than primates. The word Quincan or Quinkin is used to refer to figures from ancient Australian rock art located in Queensland and currently estimated to be between 15,000 and 40,000 years old. The Angara are the current occupants of the land, and their interpretation divides the figures into benevolent Timuras and sinister Imjins, among others. The Timuras are said to be tall, slender figures with elongated limbs and drooping ears, being good spirits with a mischievous streak, while the short, stumpy Imjins were far more sinister, often stealing children and being capable of leaping incredible distances by utilising their kangaroo-like tails. Yowie proponents often point to the figure of Taramuli, a huge, hairy and cannibalistic Quincan, as being a mythologically distorted version of a real, undescribed bipedal ape. However, to me at least, Taramuli comes across as a very common archetypal character found across human cultures, the dangerous man-eating giant. Beings like this are present in many ancient and modern sources, such as the Japanese Oni, the Old English Grendel of Beowulf, the Greek Cyclops Polyphemus, and the Indian Rakshasas. Yet you don't see cryptozoologists arguing that all of these were actually unknown carnivorous hominids, and the so-called Yowie is just the same in my opinion. Another name often lumped together with the Yowie is the Yarama Yahoo, which is a vampiric creature that resembles a red-skinned frog-like man with a huge mouth, bulging eyes, and suckers at the end of its fingers, which also doesn't sound much like a Sasquatch-type ape man. Indeed, exactly how the term Yahoo itself entered Australian English is poorly understood. It is often claimed to be an Aboriginal word, used to describe the hairy supernatural entities outlined earlier, although this is very difficult to prove. It is equally, and perhaps more likely, that the term was brought to Australia alongside British colonists. Yahoo first appeared in English literature as the brutish humanoid creatures featured in Jonathan Swift's famous Gulliver's Travels, published in 1726. The book turning out to be quite popular, it was therefore not surprising that when showmen began touring around England and Australia, showing off a captured orangutan or some other great ape beginning in the early 1800s, they referred to it as a Yahoo. That this word was used to refer to brutish humanoids across the Anglosphere is confirmed by an account, more accurately a tall tale, by 18th century American frontiersman Daniel Boone, wherein he claims to have killed a hairy giant, referred to as a Yahoo. Thus, among 19th century Australians, Yahoo became the de facto common English word for an ape-like wild man. Of course, this could all be a matter of convergence as well, with British colonists bringing ideas about Yahoos, wild men and great apes with them, only to find that Aboriginal people also referred to their own hairy supernatural entities as Yahoos as well, or something similar. Therefore, reports such as those laid out earlier of encounters with large ape-like mystery creatures may have been the result of a cultural clash, with European settlers hearing about Aboriginal traditions and interpreting them as descriptions of flesh and blood apes roaming about in the bush, much as tales of the bunyip were thought to relate information about some large unknown aquatic predator. Also like the bunyip, there was a continued Yowie flap spanning the late 19th century and into the first decade of the 20th. Furthered by print media, it seemed as if these cryptic apes were suddenly everywhere, with newspapers relaying a whole host of close encounters. In 1876, a pair of sightings by white settlers, published in the Sydney papers, became among the earliest known media coverage of the Yowie. The reports began with a young shepherd's encounter with an, quote, unearthly, inhuman-looking being, unquote, while tending his flock near the head of the Lachlan River in New South Wales. The boy, whose name was Porter, was reportedly overcome with fear when he saw the creature charging towards him down some nearby rocks. He abandoned his sheep and, along with his similarly terror-stricken dogs, fled back to his homestead. Porter told his father what happened, and together they returned to where the boy had been chased by the monster, but found nothing. A few days later, a group of young men and women fishing in the Rocky Bridge waterholes, also in New South Wales, had their own encounter with the creature. Quote, the majority of the group had gone off to set their lines, leaving a single young woman behind to prepare their supper. While so engaged, the woman was startled to see what she at first thought to be a member of her party approaching the cooking fire, only to realise that instead it was an unsightly and inhuman being with a big red face and hands and legs covered with long shaggy hair. The horrified young lady was frozen in fright, only to be able to let out a terrified scream, which alerted her companions. Her friends came running, and the creature stood some distance off for a minute or two, before deciding to retreat into the nearby rocks. They followed the monster up the mountainous terrain, when it suddenly turned on them and stood its ground. The men halted their advance, allowing them to get a good view of the beast. The head was covered with dark grisly hair. The face was shaggy darkish hair, the back and belly and down the leg covered with a lighter colour, read the newspaper report, unquote. The Yahoo then surprised them all by doubling back and again running towards their fire and the rest of the group. This evoked a primal terror in the witnesses, who were relieved to see that by some luck had decided to veer off into the rocky terrain and out of sight. Settlers in the area organised a search party to hunt the beast down, but were ultimately unsuccessful. In an article titled Australian Apes, appearing 6 years later, amateur naturalist Henry James McCooey claims to have seen a, quote, indigenous ape, unquote, on the south coast of New South Wales, between Bateman's Bay and Ulladulla. Quote, a few days ago I saw one of these strange creatures on the coast. I should think that if it was standing perfectly upright, it would be nearly 5 feet high. It was tailless and covered with very long black hair, which was of a dirty red or snuff colour about the throat and breast. Its eyes, which were small and restless, were partly hidden by matted hair that covered its head. I threw a stone at the animal, whereupon it immediately rushed off, unquote. This rash of sightings died off during the early 20th century as Australia began to urbanise rapidly, although supposed encounters with the Yahoo occurred at lower frequencies in the following decades. However, it would be the 1970s that were to be the making of the modern Aussie cryptid, with the big ape not only acquiring the name Yowie at this time, but gaining traits from its more famous North American cousin, Bigfoot. In 1972, one of the early books about the American Bigfoot and the Nepalese Yeti was published in Australia and received reviews in the press in Sydney. This was only a few years after the famous Patterson-Gimlin film came to light, which drove a surge of interest in Sasquatch, going into a decade that was very much interested in all things mysterious. Among those reading with great interest was the paranormalist and prominent Australian UFO author Rex Gilroy. Turning to Aboriginal mythology, Gilroy identified a creature called a Changara and declared that Bigfoot was found in Australia as well as the United States and Nepal, to much press coverage. Gilroy and his wife Heather dubbed themselves the Australasian Cryptozoological Research Centre, and then set about hunting for parallels between their Australian Bigfoot and creatures from Aboriginal mythology. Thus, as Bigfoot hunters in North America pointed to strange faces on totem poles and dug through indigenous American lore to find mystical-sounding words like Wendigo, which they could frame as a sort of bastardized heritage for Bigfoot, the same appropriation was also taking place halfway around the world in Australia. Gilroy listed dozens of apparently localised names for the Yowie from across the continent, suggesting that this all points to the presence of an unknown mystery hominid found all over Australia. However, there are over 300 Australian Aboriginal languages from at least 28 language families. How many mystical creatures would be found in the cultural legends of all those different groups? I doubt anyone has ever tried to estimate this, but it has to be an enormous number. The idea that all of these different names listed would be referring to the same creature found throughout the continent strains both philological and anthropological credibility. This is not evidence that a single physical creature was well known by many names throughout the many cultures that make up the Aboriginal world. It is evidence instead that cryptozoologists have collected as many old legends as they can in an effort to bolster their belief by claiming, without evidence or credibility, that those legends all match their particular creature. If a comprehensive study in comparative mythology was done among these languages, which, given how many of these are nearly extinct, is likely impossible, chances are slim that a creature would emerge that is consistently described continent-wide. Those minority of the folkloric creatures, for which a uniform physical description even exists, differ profoundly from the Bigfoot-style creature described today, such as the Yarramayahu and the Quinkans. Gilroy is also the man responsible for popularising the name Yowie, which was not his own creation, but probably stems from the Gamilaroi people, with the term Yowie appearing in an 1875 book detailing their traditions, where it is listed as a vague spirit that roams over the land at night. It is noteworthy that this Yowie appears in the book alongside other beings that are clearly supernatural, including spirits of the dead. Thus, the Yowie mutated into the Yowie, which is the name that stuck from then on. Gilroy's Yowie, which he saw as being one and the same as the American Sasquatch, therefore took on familiar traits of those cryptids, including the leaving of huge footprints, which were never mentioned in the older Yahoo reports. Given the publicity stirred up by Gilroy's writings, it is not surprising that the 1970s saw a huge pulse of Yowie sightings. In the March 13, 1977 edition of the Sydney Morning Herald, a famous Yowie encounter was recorded as taking place on Oxley Island near Taree, New South Wales. The newspaper article details that, quote, "Families on the island report hearing blood-curdling screams and shrieks at night, and the noises are quite alien to the isolated river island, which relies on it dairying for its livelihood. Residents are now convinced that the screams are connected with the sighting of a strange creature by island resident Mrs. G. She looked out of her kitchen window recently to see a huge black furry creature standing on the end of their jetty. She said, 'I ran to get the binoculars for a close-up view and was sure we had an enormous ape on the wharf. I was going down to investigate when the telephone rang, and when I returned the animal had disappeared.' Unquote. Mrs. G and her son later found strange footprints, supposedly belonging to the creature, and it was noted that the mystery ape left behind a very strong odour, which is a common feature of Sasquatch sightings as well. Rather suspiciously, these encounters were only reported when people on the island found out that Rex Gilroy would be visiting nearby Taree later that month. It should also be noted that the proposed Yowie footprints are extremely variable both in size and in the number of toes, ranging from 3 to more than 6, which would be very odd for a primate. However, I feel that it would be far more interesting to imagine the potential source of these accounts as being some kind of shaggy-coated large marsupial that only very vaguely resembles an upright ape, perhaps some speculative relative of the extinct diprotodontian Palorchestes that could briefly stand on its hind legs. But I digress. Encounters with the Yowie and their tracks spread across Australia from this time onwards, although New South Wales to this day holds the highest number of sightings. By the 1990s, the mantle of top mystery ape investigator was handed to a guy called Timothy Bull, who legally changed his name via deed poll to Tim the Yowie Man. Yes, really. Tim claims to have seen a Yowie in 1994 when he was hiking in the Snowy Mountains, describing the creature as being 8 feet tall, covered in black fur, having long arms and no neck. A famous story recorded in Tim's 2001 book involved a couple from Newcastle, New South Wales, who had a Yowie encounter on holiday in 1996. Belinda Garford and her husband watched a Yowie cross the King's Highway between Braidwood and the coast. Peter had pulled to the side of the road to rest the car's brakes when he saw the creature in their rear view mirror, and both turned to watch it for 5 to 10 seconds. It was, they say, at least 2.1 metres or 7 feet tall, with disproportionately long arms, no neck, shaggy and with an upright walk. Sightings much like this, even accompanied by the occasional out-of-focus video clip or photo, making them close encounters of the blurred kind, continue up to the present. A fairly recent, well-publicised Yowie sighting occurred in 2021, wherein 3 friends from Jimna, Queensland, came across the creature while driving home from work. The men said they spotted a slouched-over figure standing under a streetlight, which quickly turned towards them. Seamus Fitzgerald, as told to the Mail Courier, described the mysterious figure as having, quote, very long arms and an ape-like face. He said, "We initially thought it was a boar or a very big animal until we got closer and saw it run off in a very ape-like way. I've never really had a paranormal or strange experience like that before. I hardly slept that night, and the feeling was overwhelming that I had seen something that I've never believed in previously," unquote. Despite this long litany of sightings, no convincing evidence for the Yowie's existence has ever been provided. No DNA, no hair samples, no scat, nothing. Instead of being a real flesh and blood ape, a far-fetched concept in itself, given Australia's lack of megafaunal animals of Southeast Asian origin, let alone a surviving Gigantopithecus-like species. The modern Yowie legend instead builds on both older stories of the Yahoo and, since the 1970s, American Bigfoot lore. The Yahoo traditions of the 19th century probably originated due to British colonial misunderstandings of Aboriginal beliefs concerning hairy spirits, assuming these stories to describe ape-like humanoids and not spirit beings. Much like the bunyip, the Yahoo became a national phenomenon due to the expanding print media in Australia. With the development of the Bigfoot craze after the release of the Patterson-Gimlin film in the late 1960s, this led to the modern interpretation of the Yowie, with the Australian sightings having very similar tropes and themes to those in North America. Indeed, Sasquatch-type creatures now apparently have a near global range, with encounters recorded in the most unlikely of places, even including a country as nature-denuded as the UK. We are then dealing with a socio-cultural beast rather than a living one, with the Yowie ape-man tradition of Australia evolving from Aboriginal origins as feared spiritual entities, to then be appropriated by British colonists at a time of significant zoological developments and interest in non-human apes. Older Aboriginal ideas merged with the Europeans' ideas concerning swifts, yahoos, wild men and primates, in a land that was considered, to them, alien and bizarre. The figure of the Yahoo was therefore a crystallisation of colonial fears regarding both the indigenous population, the unfamiliar landscape and the unique wildlife, like that found nowhere else. Add in a dash of Sasquatch culture and you get the modern Yowie, a most Australian mishmash of folkloric influences. Thanks for watching, everyone. The next episode will be covering the iconic yet mysterious Eocene beast Andrewsarchus and its convoluted history. See you again soon. Cheerio.